It was just after 11 p.m. in the quiet East London suburb of Woodford Green when 6 shots shattered the night. A man stood in his kitchen, unaware he was being watched from the darkness of his back garden. Moments later, 2 bullets tore through the glass, striking him in the neck and hand. The victim? Paul Allen, once a feared cage fighter, and more infamously, the right-hand man in Britain's biggest cash robbery. Now, bleeding out on the kitchen floor of a luxury home, Allen's past had come back with lethal intent. But this wasn't a random attack. It was the climax of a carefully orchestrated plan, involving surveillance, tracking devices, international burglaries, and a murder plot that spanned 2 countries. The men behind it? 3 seasoned criminals with a taste for high-stakes jobs and a determination to settle old scores. Their mission nearly succeeded, but in the years that followed, detectives would pick apart every move, every message, every mile driven, and what they uncovered was something far darker than a revenge hit. This is the story of how Daniel Kelly and the Ahern brothers almost pulled off the perfect execution and how they lost everything in the process. To understand the motive behind the shooting, you first have to understand the man at the center of it all, Paul Allen. He wasn't just a name in the criminal underworld, he was a legend. In 2006, Allen played a central role in what remains Britain's largest cash robbery, the Securitas Depot heist in Tonbridge, Kent. The plan was cinematic in scale: armed men in masks, a manager's family kidnapped and held hostage, staff tied up at gunpoint, and over £54 million in cash packed into a 7-ton lorry and driven away under the cover of night. It was bold, violent, flawless, almost. The authorities caught up with Allen, and in 2009, he was sentenced to 18 years. But the money? Most of it was never recovered, and neither were the grudges. By 2019, Allen was a free man. He'd traded the shadows of the criminal world for a quieter life, or so it seemed. Now in his 40s, he was living with his partner and children in a luxury rented home in Woodford Green, East London. It was the kind of place that suggested new beginnings. Detached, respectable, tucked away from his past. But the past has a way of catching up. Allen had been the trusted lieutenant of Lee Lightning Murray, the infamous cage fighter turned mastermind of the Securitas job. Both were known for precision, for ruthlessness, and for a certain code among thieves. Yet in a world where loyalties are as fragile as freedom, it didn't take much to turn old alliances into targets. And that's what Allen had become, a target. Whether it was revenge, unfinished business, or an attempt to silence a man who knew too much, someone had decided his time was up. But this wouldn't be a street corner hit or a pub brawl. What was coming for Paul Allen had been planned, tracked, scoped. And when the bullets came through his kitchen window, they weren't just aimed at his body, they were aimed at everything he once represented. The men who came for Paul Allen weren't reckless or impulsive. They were cold, disciplined, and deeply embedded in organized crime. Daniel Kelly was a career criminal known for his reach beyond UK borders. Stuart and Louis Ahern, brothers from southeast London, had long been operating in the shadows. They didn't make moves without planning them first, and when they did, the stakes were usually high. Weeks before the shooting, the trio had already proven what they were capable of. In Switzerland, they orchestrated a high-value museum burglary that saw rare Ming Dynasty antiques disappear overnight. The execution was slick, the getaway clean, and the artifacts worth millions briefly vanished into the criminal underworld. Kelly and Louis even flew to Asia, trying to sell one of the stolen pieces through a legitimate auction house. It wasn't just about money, it was about reach, boldness, and believing they were untouchable. But by July 2019, their attention had shifted dramatically and violently back home. Paul Allen was now in their sights. The motive behind the hit remains murky. Was it personal? A score to settle from their shared past in the criminal world? Or was Allen, recently out of prison, seen as a threat, someone who knew too much or had talked to the wrong people? What's clear is how calculated the lead-up was. The men planted a GPS tracker on Allen's car, a black Mercedes, and synced it to an iPad. They didn't guess his movements, they studied them. Every trip, every stop, every return home was logged. When he was inside, when he was alone, how long he stayed out, all of it monitored in real time. That same iPad, later found at the bottom of the Thames, would become a silent witness in court, a digital roadmap to a planned assassination. This wasn't rage, it wasn't random, it was targeted. And what had started with stolen art and bold escapes was about to escalate into something far more permanent: murder. By the evening of July 11th, 2019, the plan was in motion. The Renault Captur, a seemingly ordinary hire car, had been secured 2 days earlier by Stuart Ahern. But this wasn't its first outing. Just the night before, it had been used in a burglary at a gated community in Sevenoaks, Kent. The gang had posed as police officers, fitted the vehicle with a blue flashing light, and broken into a luxury flat. Handbags, designer clothes, and cash were taken. Now, with the same car and a new target, their intentions were far more violent. That night, the trio left their home turf in Woolwich, southeast London, and crossed the city under the cover of darkness. Their route took them through the Blackwall Tunnel, cutting north towards Woodford Green. It was a calculated journey, one they'd made before during their surveillance runs. They knew exactly where to go. Stuart Ahern parked the car on Worcester Avenue, just behind the target's home. While he stayed behind the wheel, acting as lookout and getaway driver, Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahern slipped through a neighbouring garden. From this vantage point, they had a clear view of Paul Allen's back garden and, crucially, his kitchen. Just after 11:09 p.m, the silence shattered. 6 rounds were fired through the glass doors and windows, the sudden cracks tearing through the night like thunder. Allen had been standing in the kitchen. One bullet hit his hand, another tore into his neck and lodged near his spinal cord. He collapsed on the floor as his partner, Jade Bovington, screamed for help. Within seconds, Kelly and Lewis were gone, back through the garden, into the waiting car, and away into the darkness. Allen's life hung in the balance. Paramedics and police arrived within minutes. He was rushed into emergency surgery, where doctors managed to save his life. But the damage was irreversible. The bullet that struck his neck had severed his spinal cord. The once feared cage fighter, who'd helped pull off the biggest cash robbery in British history, was now paralyzed from the chest down. The gunman hadn't finished the job, but they'd changed a life forever. In the aftermath of the shooting, the scene was chaotic, but detectives knew time was critical. The Metropolitan Police cordoned off Malvern Drive and began their work. Forensics combed through the garden, the house, and the surrounding properties. Within hours, crucial clues began to emerge. 5 bullet casings were found, scattered near a summer house at the rear of the garden. Ballistics confirmed they came from a Glock SLP handgun, a model often favoured in organised crime due to its compact design and stopping power. Inside the house, another bullet had lodged in a doorframe, missing Allen by inches, but it was the swabs taken from a nearby fence panel that delivered the first major breakthrough. DNA recovered from that fence, just yards from the firing position, provided a match to both Daniel Kelly and Louis Ahern. A second major lead came when officers searched Kelly's address. Hidden among his belongings was a laser sight compatible with the Glock model used in the attack, an accessory often used to enhance accuracy in low light. It was damning. Meanwhile, investigators followed the trail of the hire car. CCTV and ANPR footage captured the Renault Capture travelling from Woolwich to Woodford Green and back again. The vehicle had been hired 2 days before the shooting by Stuart Ahern. When police finally recovered it, Kelly's fingerprints were found on the dashboard and passenger side door, but perhaps the most telling piece of evidence came later. In 2024, nearly 5 years after the attack, officers retrieved an iPad from the River Thames near the O2 Arena. Forensics experts managed to extract fragments of location data, even after it had been wiped. It had been used to track Paul Allen's Mercedes in the days leading up to the shooting. The digital trail was complete. Every breadcrumb led back to the same 3 men. While the attempted murder in Woodford Green dominated headlines in the UK, it was far from the only serious crime the trio had on their record. Just weeks before the shooting of Paul Allen, Daniel Kelly and the Ahern brothers were already on the radar of Swiss authorities for a separate high-value burglary, one that bore all the hallmarks of a professional, premeditated job. On the night of June 1st, 2019, the trio broke into the Museum of Far Eastern Arts in Geneva. Their entry was methodical. Wearing gloves, masks, and forehead lamps, they used an angle grinder, crowbar, and sledgehammer to force open the museum's doors. Once inside, they headed straight for a display labelled Room 3, home to some of the museum's most valuable artifacts. In under 5 minutes, they had smashed open display case 13 and escaped with 3 rare Ming Dynasty porcelain pieces: a delicate phoenix design bowl from the 14th century, a tiny chicken cup from the 15th, and a pomegranate-decorated bottle valued at nearly £2 million alone. In total, the haul was worth over £2.7 million, and just like that, they vanished. 2 weeks later, the group flew to Hong Kong in an attempt to sell the Phoenix Bowl at an auction house. But it was back in London where their plan began to unravel. In October 2020, Stuart Ahern was arrested during a sting operation at a central London hotel where he was trying to sell the stolen vase to an undercover police officer posing as a buyer. A subsequent search uncovered a fake passport in Stuart's name and a book on Ming Dynasty antiques, further tying them to the Geneva burglary. The Aherns were extradited to Switzerland, convicted of aggravated theft, and later returned to the UK to face far graver charges. By March 2025, nearly 6 years after Paul Allen was gunned down in his own kitchen, the full weight of the case was laid bare before a jury at the Old Bailey. It had taken years of forensic work, international cooperation, and painstaking investigation to reach this point. Now, the evidence, collected from gardens, devices, vehicles, and even riverbeds, was presented in sharp detail. Prosecutors wasted no time in dismantling the defendant's narrative. They walked the court through the planning stages: the tracking device planted on Allen's car, the hire car used for surveillance, the DNA found on a garden fence, the Glock handgun's spent casings, and the laser sight recovered from Kelly's home. Each thread of evidence tightened the noose. The defense tried to muddy the waters. They claimed coincidence. They questioned the reliability of the digital trail. At one point, Daniel Kelly insisted in a prepared statement that he held no grudge against Allen, claiming they'd known each other for over 2 decades and had always been on good terms. But the jury wasn't buying it. Friendship doesn't end in gunfire through a kitchen window. Paul Allen himself never took the stand. His injuries had changed his life irreversibly, but his silence didn't matter. The data, the footage, the fingerprints, those spoke louder than any testimony ever could. On 24th March 2025, the verdict was read out. All 3 men, Daniel Kelly, Stuart Ahern, and Louis Ahern, were found guilty of conspiracy to murder. As the decision was delivered, Stuart Ahern shouted at the jury, "You're only human. That's all I have to say about that." the courtroom fell silent. Justice had been delivered. But the impact of what had happened and how far the conspirators had gone would echo far beyond the verdict. This case was never just about one man being shot in his kitchen. It was about the lengths some will go to silence the past. It was about international art theft, digital surveillance, and violent retribution wrapped into a single web of criminality. The shooting exposed a layer of criminal enterprise most people associate with films, not real life. Ming Dynasty antiques, GPS trackers, hired getaway cars, gangsters posing as police officers to burgle high-end homes. And behind it all, 3 men from southeast London, each believing they were too smart to get caught. But they were wrong. Detectives didn't just respond to a shooting, they built a case that spanned years, borders, and disciplines. They worked with Swiss authorities, digital forensics teams, firearms analysts, and surveillance experts. They pulled an iPad from the bottom of a river and turned it into courtroom evidence. They found Kelly's fingerprints in a hire car returned weeks earlier. They put together a timeline so tight, it left the defense with nowhere to hide. Paul Allen survived, but his life was permanently altered. The man who once helped mastermind a £54 million robbery now moves through the world in a wheelchair, his past etched into every scar. And yet, justice was served, not just for him, but for a system too often outpaced by modern crime. Daniel Kelly, Stuart Ahern, Lewis Ahern. Their days of plotting in the shadows are over. Sentencing is set for April 25th, and the only journeys they'll be taking now are between a cell and a courtroom. This wasn't just a failed hit, it was a reminder that even in a world of encrypted apps, fake passports, and international escapes, someone is always watching. And if the evidence doesn't get you, the river might still give up your secrets.